Part 1. There was an orphan boy called Edward, and he lived a life that he could only describe as a nightmare. For effectively all of his 8 years, he had lived at a workhouse on the fringes of a Maine town. Queen Victoria was on the throne, and Britain was at the heart of a major empire. Edward was playing his part in it, though he wished he wasn't. His lot in life was to work, and work hard. He was one of over 100 boys in the workhouse. There were men, women, and girls there too, and all were segregated into those groups. He would stay among the boys until he was old enough to move into the men group. But as things were, he would be lucky to live long enough to see that day. The reason being, a man called Mr. Stone. Mr. Stone was in charge of the boys, along with 2 other men. He was there to supervise, to ensure that the boys didn't slack or cause trouble, and the cane he always carried was the response he would give to those who did. But Mr. Stone loved using it, and he found reasons to do so. He was a bully, and he had the authority. All of the boys hated him, but they couldn't speak out against him. Edward was no troublemaker, but he was deemed soft by Mr. Stone, who used that as a reason to make his bum sting. Edward hated him with every ounce of his strength, and to be free from this vile creature's domain was his ultimate dream. His dream would come true, but it would take a bit of fortune to happen. Even with the fortune that would come his way, he still needed a plan. A plan to escape from this prison and the evil Mr. Stone. Due to the fact that the building only had one entrance, which also served as the exit, leaving unauthorized was nigh on impossible, since it was guarded. But exiting the building was possible under certain circumstances. There was a yard for recreation, and each week, the boys would get 1 hour in the yard to get away from their labor. Just a short distance from the yard was the delivery area. All the food and supplies came from elsewhere, and for Edward, the horse-drawn carts were his ticket out. If only he could sneak over to a cart without being spotted. It wasn't just the supervisors who could rat on him, but the other boys too. But as stated, fate would smile on him, and an opportunity would present itself. In the days prior, there was some friction developing between some of the boys. Edward was merely one of the bystanders, playing no part in it. But he would be grateful for it. When they all headed outside for their recreation, the growing tension was finally released, and the rival groups got into a scrap that kept Mr. Stone and his assistants busy. The other boys were all keen to watch the mass fight unfold. It was an opportunity that Edward couldn't pass up. He slowly walked off, towards the delivery drop-off point, hiding behind any boxes he came across. It just so happened that there was a delivery cart present. It had come with a delivery of firewood. The workhouse used wood over coal, because it was cheaper. Having sneaked this far, Edward's next task was to sneak aboard the cart without being seen. He watched from his current hiding place, as workers helped carry the shipment of wood into the storehouse. He just needed the coast to be clear. He made a run for it, and clambered onto the cart, and took full advantage of the canvas that was used to protect the wood from getting damp. He lay down beneath it, and hoped that he remained undiscovered. The next few minutes seemed like ages, as he waited for the cart to move. Even when the cart did start to move, he opted against peeking out, for fear of being caught. He chose to wait a good many minutes before risking it, and when he did, it was a wonderful sight. The workhouse was fading away in the distance. He had escaped. But even now, his plight was far from over. He had to get off the cart before it reached its destination. Wherever that was, it was taking a while to get there, for when he opted to take another look, there was open countryside all around. The workhouse was miles away. Seeing that the time was right, he crawled to the back of the cart, and taking advantage of its slow pace, jumped off. I'm free. I'm free, he said in a low, but emotional voice. I'm hungry too. He now set about searching for food, which came about by finding an orchard. He gathered up as many fallen apples as he could, then found a place to sit and eat them. While he was now miles from the workhouse, his ordeal was not over. His absence would be noted eventually, and there was the possibility that a search party could be sent out to look for him. For now, he had a head start, but he couldn't hang about. He had to keep moving. He stuck to walking through fields, rather than along the country roads, to avoid being seen. He was wearing the usual jacket and trousers of a workhouse boy, plus a cheap pair of shoes. He had an untidy mullet of hair on his head, which was unusual really, though he wasn't the only one. Mr. Stone had deemed a number of boys girly and had made them have mullets to make them stand out from the rest. Little did he realize now that this would help his cause. He kept on walking, trying to find food where possible, and using streams for both drinking water and a place to wash. For now, he only wanted to travel. He didn't know what he wanted to do in the long term, but for now, life was better. There was no cane-wielding sadist casting a shadow over him. As he feared, his absence was noticed, and those in charge started by searching the premises. Only when they were certain that Edward was not on the premises, did they consider looking beyond. But they needed to know how he had slipped through the net. The only way he could have gotten out was to sneak aboard a horse-drawn cart, said Mr. Stiles, the proprietor of the workhouse. I thought you had complete control over the boys, Mr. Stone? I do. But what is one to do when a group of them start a fight? We had our hands full. And this Edward obviously used this as a means to escape. For all we know, he could have instigated the whole affair. He couldn't start a fight if he tried, the little sissy, hissed Mr. Stone. We'll find him, and he'll regret ever managing to escape. You'd better, or you'll be searching for new employers, said Mr. Stiles. Anyway, I've had to get the police involved. They'll help with a search, and since it's partly your fault, you can go with them. That's fine with me. But there were many miles now between Edward and the workhouse, as he was now truly in the rural countryside, with farmland in all directions. It was easy to get lost, with so many similar-looking fields. As day turned to night, the need to find a place to sleep became paramount, and farm barns were as good as any. His hopes of not being found were aided just 2 days after leaving the cart. It rained heavily one day, and that helped wash away any footprints he had left in the last day or so. But it only made his traveling harder. The mud in the fields was deep, and on numerous occasions, he found himself face first in it. If he found a stream, he tried to clean himself, but he wanted to get dry, not wetter. While he was able to find food, he wasn't getting enough, and soon, hunger and exhaustion were to get the better of him. To get away from the muddy fields, he had gone back to a road, or so he thought. It was the path leading up to a large country house. It was dark, so he didn't know. Overcome with fatigue, he slumped close to the path, by some trees. The sun had barely risen when a simple horse and trap came up the path. Inside were Mary and her 16-year-old daughter, Sophie. Both were employees at the house, with Mary having the high position of housekeeper. Sophie was also a servant, but had been assigned a special duty. They lived in a cottage not far away, and they had been given the transport to get to the house. Mom! Look, over there, pointed Sophie. Is that a person? Mary looked over to where her daughter was pointing, and noticed Edward too. She called for the trap to be stopped, and they both went to have a look. It's a boy, exclaimed Mary. Is he dead? Asked Sophie. No, he's asleep. But he looks in a bad way, said Mary. We'll get him to the house and see what we can do for him. Edward hardly stirred as Mary picked him up and carried him back to the trap. He was cold, and his clothes were soiled in mud. Where do you think he came from? Asked Sophie. They look like workhouse clothes, said Mary. But perhaps he'll tell us when he awakens. The horse and trap arrived at the house a few minutes later, stopping by the staff entrance. Mary was among a few members of staff who were not residents. While she carried Edward, who was starting to stir, Sophie went and opened the door. Good morning, Mary, said Albert, the butler. What do you have here? We've just found him lying by the roadside, on our way here, said Mary. He needs warming up, a good bath, and no doubt, some food inside him. Okay, but what do you intend on doing with him afterwards? Asked Albert. I don't know yet, said Mary, who had now sat the boy on a stool in the kitchen, close to the fire. Hey, we don't want dirty boys in my clean kitchen, said Doris, who was preparing breakfast for the family of the house. Sorry, but I've just found this boy outside, and he needs warming up, said Mary. Mom, I'm going to attend to Charlotte, if you'll allow me, said Sophie, who had removed her coat. Sure, go ahead, said Mary. Looks like he's stirring. Edward was stirring, and as he opened his eyes, he saw Doris looking at him. Fear got hold of him. Don't hurt me, please don't hurt me, he exclaimed. We're not going to hurt you, said Doris. We found you outside, and you clearly need some food, warmth, and clean clothes, said Mary. No idea what you'll do about the clothes, said Doris. No boy's clothes of his size around here. That's awkward, said Mary. But his clothes are dirty and need washing. While there were men in the house, all were older than Edward. Even Mary couldn't help, as Sophie was her only child. But while the clothes problem was yet to be solved, they needed to calm the boy down. He was still frightened. He still thinks we're going to hurt him, said Doris. Listen to us, said Mary, in a gentle tone. We want to help you. Now, I'm going to give you a nice hot bath, to get you all clean, and Doris will provide you with something to eat. But Edward would have to wait, for Mary had her regular duties to attend to, so Doris remained his only company for the next few minutes. She was soon joined by Susan, who was very much an assistant to both Doris and Mary. She did the laundry, helped with the cooking, and also did housework. She had to take a second glance when she noticed Edward. Mary found him outside, said Doris. She's going to give him a bath when she returns. He looks like he's been on the run, said Susan. So, what's your name? Edward didn't answer. He hasn't told us anything, said Doris. Except for asking us not to hurt him. It wasn't too long before Mary did return, and she set about giving Edward his bath. The servants had their own bathroom, though it wasn't as good as those belonging to the heads of the house. Still, it served its purpose. Edward, still not talking much, followed Mary to the bathroom and watched as she filled a bathtub with water. Okay, so let's get these clothes off you, she said. Don't be frightened. He allowed her to take his clothes off, but it was now that his words about not wanting to be hurt became clear. There were cane marks across his back and backside, and the sight caused her to cover her mouth. She went to fetch Doris and Susan. They all saw the scars and understood. Wherever he comes from, I'm pretty certain I don't want him to go back, said Mary. I agree, said Doris. That isn't punishment, that's torture. Mary continued with giving him a bath, though the scars made things awkward, as they were sensitive. She also washed his hair and brushed it out. Okay, so if you didn't hear us the first time, we won't send you back to where you came from, she told him. So, what's your name? Edward, he replied, in a low voice. Okay, so do you have a family? He shook his head. You come from a workhouse, don't you? She asked. He shuddered at the mention of the word. Okay, I understand. Now, your clothes need washing, and the only clothes we have in your size are girls' ones. He didn't reply, but he was clearly mulling the situation. Looking at his hair, Mary thought of something. She wasn't sure whether anyone would come looking for him, but in the off chance that they did. Edward, is there any chance that they might look for you? She asked. Not sure, he replied, his voice showing fear. Look, I think we can hide you from them, but it will require you dress as a girl. He thought about it, and agreed. It was the prospect of hiding that bought him. For now, he settled on a bathrobe, as he was led back to the kitchen. By now, the breakfasts had been done for the family of the house, and Doris had some leftovers that Edward could eat. He didn't need a second invite to eat what was offered. So, how are we going to keep him from going back? Asked Doris. By dressing him as a girl, explained Mary. How is that going to help? Asked Susan. If the workhouse lot come looking, they'll be looking for a boy, not a girl, said Mary. But what about his clothes then? Asked Doris. If they find them, they'll know he's here. We'll have to find a way to get rid of them then, said Mary. By the way, Doris, do you want to have a niece, perhaps? You mean? Look, I don't have any extra family that could be his parents. You do have a sister. Okay, so I'm an auntie now, said Doris. But if my niece is to stay here with us, then wouldn't it be wise if the master knew? It would, on the chance that they do come down here, said Mary. But first, we need to get our new girl some clothes, and more so, do something with her hair. Edward's medium brown hair was long for a boy, but not massively long. Still, now that it had been washed and brushed, it certainly had the potential. Albert, being head of the staff, was keen to hear on the plan, and after seeing Edward's scarred back, was willing to aid in the charade. There you go, said Mary. Well, I doubt anyone would guess that you're a boy. Edward was now wearing a dress and petticoat, and his hair was now curled at the ends to make it look more feminine. So, we just need a name now, said Albert. I think Ella would suit him, I mean her, said Sophie, who was taking a break from her assigned job. Seriously, with longer hair, she would look really pretty. I like the name, said Doris. But what about the girl herself? Edward was coming to terms with being referred to as a girl, but it was all part of hiding from the people he truly hated. But another factor would come into play, the chance of a better life. The next part of the plan was to introduce Ella to the man and woman of the house, and this would see Edward's life improve further. Sir Richard Hughes was the master of the house, and lived with his wife Lady Margaret, and their 8-year-old daughter Charlotte. Sir Richard was the head of a major firm in the city, and while his business was centered in the city, he had chosen to live in the country in a stately house. He did spend most of his time away, leaving his wife as the one to receive guests. Their daughter Charlotte was tutored at home, and had been assigned Sophie as her nanny, though she was more like a big sister to her. The staff chose to introduce Ella to them that evening, knowing that Sir Richard would likely be home. They had created a backstory for Ella too, to explain why she was staying at the house. Okay, so try to look happy," said Mary. "Okay, so your mom is ill, so you are worried about her, but you're staying with your Auntie Doris." Edward was finally feeling less frightened of the servants, and trying his best to be a girl. They had already given him a few lessons, including how to curtsy. He had also been given a dinner. He was led upstairs by Albert, along with Doris, who was on hand to play her part. Heading to the reception room, Albert knocked on the door before entering. "What is it?" asked Sir Robert. "Sir, your ladyship, I would like to inform you that we have someone staying with us for a few weeks." He cued Edward and Doris to enter, and Edward did his best at a curtsy. "This is my niece, Ella," said Doris. "I've been charged with looking after her, while her mother, my sister, has been taken ill." "Nice to meet you," said Sir Richard. "I hope you enjoy your brief stay here, and we hope that your mother gets well soon." "Thank you, sir," said Edward. "I imagine our daughter would be glad to meet another of her own age," said Lady Margaret. "How old are you?" "I'm 8 years old," said Edward, again doing his best to be polite. "Well, that is how old Charlotte is," replied Lady Margaret. "Albert, take her to the nursery. Charlotte will be glad of more company." "As you wish," said Albert. Edward curtsied again before leaving. "That went better than expected," said Doris. "Certainly," said Albert. "I can handle this now." Doris took the hint to return to the kitchen, and did so, while Edward was taken to the nursery. Upon arriving, it was Sophie who opened the door. She saw Albert and then Edward. "Her ladyship has requested that Ella be introduced to her daughter," said Albert. "Oh, okay," said Sophie. Edward entered the room, and soon got to see Charlotte. She was dressed nearly identically to him, and her blonde hair reached below her shoulders. "Charlotte, you have a new friend to play with," said Sophie. "This is Ella." Charlotte came over to say hello, and was clearly delighted to have another friend. "Hello, Ella, nice to meet you," she said. "Would you like to meet my dolls?" Edward wasn't sure, but opted to go along and was soon being introduced to all of Charlotte's toys. While the room was called a nursery, it was really Charlotte's bedroom. Sophie, being in the know about Ella, decided to keep quiet on that secret, and continued in her role of nanny/big sister. She also tidied up the room, though Charlotte had chosen to help on occasions. She was also ready to help Edward if he came stuck on certain terms. One excuse was easy to make: Ella came from a working-class family, and didn't have the multitude of toys and clothes that Charlotte did. But all in all, Edward actually enjoyed the rest of the day. Charlotte remained oblivious to his gender, and found him to be a wonderful new friend. She did ask him if he was staying for a few days, and he said that he was, mentioning that Doris the cook was his aunt. At 8 p.m., Charlotte was set to go to bed. Edward stayed while Sophie helped the girl get ready. They did receive a visit from Sir Richard and Lady Margaret, who wished to say good night to their daughter. They also said good night to Edward too, and were pleased to see that they had quickly become friends. With Charlotte in bed, Sophie led Edward back to the servants' quarters, where he would be spending every night for the next week or so. In fact, the servants had yet to determine exactly how long he would be staying. He was given some toast and a glass of milk as a late supper, before he was shown to the room where he was to sleep. It was where Doris and Susan slept, and they had found another mattress for him to sleep on. When he fell asleep that night, he felt happy. Despite the need to dress as a girl, he had been in the company of people who had cared for him. While he had been with Charlotte, the servants had been discussing Edward's future. While it was decided that he was set to stay a few days, they had yet to decide the extent of his stay. "So, it all depends on whether the workhouse decides to send out a search party," said Mary. "If that does happen, keeping him here is the best option." "Until they decide to call off the search," said Albert. "It depends on how far they are prepared to go, and how long they will try." "But even when the threat of him being found is over, what then?" "I'd gladly take him in," said Mary. "I could soon get him some boy's clothes. I imagine he would like to get his hair cut too. I wonder why he has got long hair. Workhouses usually go for really short. But for now, that long hair is helping him pass as a girl," said Susan. "It's a pity he hasn't got a family." "If he had, he wouldn't be in a workhouse," said Doris. "These past few hours, he's had more family time than he's likely had all his life. With those scars, it's clear he gets practically no love at all," said Mary. "Seriously, if I knew who was responsible, I'd like to see them taste their own medicine." "But he may be constant troublemaker," put in Albert. "That isn't punishment, that is brutality," said Doris. "Besides, I don't believe he is a troublemaker. He was far too scared this morning. The only troublemaker I can see is the one who gave him those scars," said Mary. "It's a wonder the boy is still alive. When they had dressed him, they had made an effort to hide his scars. They had also used some medicine at their disposal, in the hope that it may heal them." The search party had indeed set out, 24 hours after Edward's escape. But rather than immediately following the route taken by the cart, opted to check out the nearby town, in the off chance that he had taken refuge there. They also hoped to bolster their numbers, by getting a few locals to lend a hand. So by the time they did conclude that he wasn't in the town, they started along the route that the firewood delivery cart took. Using carts of their own, they went along, following the road, and searching every field along the way. The wheat and corn that was growing in the fields was high, and just weeks away from harvest. It certainly offered a place to hide, so searching these fields was given priority. But even as they searched, Edward was still miles ahead. And then there was the rain to come. The first full day of searching had proven fruitless, and many of the volunteers had gone home. Even the leaders had to call it a day, ready to resume the next. But the next day brought heavy rain, and that certainly hampered their search. Mr. Stone was not enjoying the fact that the search was proving slow. He just wanted to get his hands on Edward and punish him real good. Edward awoke, following the best sleep he had had in ages. The last time was before Mr. Stone had labeled him one of his favorites. He was surrounded by friendly faces, and people who truly wanted to help him. Today, his relationship with Charlotte would take a slight twist. She was set to find out that he was a boy. The decision to let her know was done as a precaution, on the off chance that she somehow found out herself and made it known to her parents. Following breakfast in the kitchen, Edward was given a wash, and his hair brushed. He was then taken to Charlotte's room by Mary. Sophie was waiting on Charlotte, for she had her meals with her parents in the dining room. When she arrived back at her room, to find Edward waiting, she was pleased, and gave her new friend a hug. Mary decided to follow them in, since she was to disclose the truth. Edward was aware of this, so didn't object when she did. "Charlotte, there is something to know about Ella," said Mary. "She's actually a boy." "What?" "No, she can't be." "I am a boy," said Edward. "Really?" "Charlotte, listen to me," said Mary. "Ella is in hiding. She is hiding from some horrible people who have hurt her. they're looking for a boy, added Sophie. So, they won't be looking for a girl. Do my mummy and daddy know? Asked Charlotte. No, they don't, said Mary. We don't want them to know either. So, keep it a secret. Charlotte was wondering what to say, and looked at Edward again. I'll keep it a secret if you promise to behave like a girl, she said. I will, he said. I don't mind, because yesterday was fun. It was? Okay then, so let's have another tea party, said Charlotte, going over to her tea set. Mary left them, and for the next hour or so, Ella was back, though Charlotte did ask more questions. Though she was still to become aware of Edward's true name, she felt Ella was a better name for him. Your hair is actually pretty, she told him. Would be nice if it were longer, but it's too long for a boy. Why have you grown it? Do you want to be a girl? I grew it, because I was made to, he said, in a low voice. He thinks boys who are soft are girls, and should have long hair like girls. This was the first time Edward had mentioned this to anyone, and even Sophie was intrigued. She decided not to say, but guessed that the man that Edward was talking about was the same one who had beat him. Well, you look nice with long hair, Ella, smiled Charlotte. Plus, being a girl is fun. Edward smiled, which pleased Sophie. If anything, she just wanted Edward to be happy, and he was being happy. His spirits had risen notably since he had arrived. It's a nice day outside, so after dinner, we can spend some time in the garden, said Sophie, who was looking out of the window. Yes, and then I can introduce you to the... Oh, we can't, said Charlotte, who went from excited to disappointed rather quickly. Introduce me to who? Asked Edward. The fairies who live in the garden, said Sophie. Only young girls can see them. Fairies? What are they? They're tiny people with wings, and they perform magic, said Charlotte. But because you're a boy, you can't see them. So, I'm not allowed to see them? Asked Edward, not getting the message. No, they'll be invisible to you, since you're a boy, said Sophie. They're invisible to me too, now, since I'm too old. So how do you know they exist? Asked Edward. Because I used to be able to see them. When you become 13, you stop. Now, I can't see or hear them, but I remember them. I can see them, said Charlotte. They're tiny, and all are pretty, and all are named after flowers. They sound nice. I really would have liked to have seen them, he sighed. Well, we can still show you the garden. It's full of colorful flowers, said Sophie. The fairies look after the garden, and the gardeners help them, smiled Charlotte. The gardeners don't know about them, and think that they are the reason the flowers all grow, chuckled Sophie. We know better. But for Edward, the talk of fairies had lost its appeal, now that he knew he wouldn't be able to see or hear them. Or so he thought. His thoughts on the term girl being used to insult him were being challenged though, as Charlotte really wanted him to enjoy being a girl. In all fairness, he wanted to, too, for he wanted to prove Mr. Stone wrong. He even allowed Sophie to put a ribbon in his medium brown hair, and felt good about it. Well, this is going to help fool anyone who is looking for him, thought Sophie. He's actually enjoying this. There was no doubt about it. Edward was enjoying playing with Charlotte's toys, and enjoying playing as a whole. But then, he had never had the opportunity to do anything of the sort whilst at the workhouse. So, when he returned to the servants' quarters for dinner, they were amazed at his appearance. He was certainly embracing the role he had been given. After dinner, he was reunited with Charlotte, and they and Sophie headed into the garden. The garden was divided into two sections, a lawn area that was directly by the house itself, and then the floral gardens, with the various borders, and a large pond at the far end. The children sat down on the lawn, where they would spend most of the time. Charlotte had brought her dolls with her, and so, the games they played in her room were continued. They were soon noticed by some of Charlotte's magical friends. There's another girl with them," said Bluebell. "I've never seen her before." "Well, she's friends with Charlotte, so she has to be friendly," said Fuchsia. "Let's introduce ourselves." The two fairies flew towards the trio of children, unaware that the one was a boy. Charlotte was the first to see them, and guessed their intent. "Oh, it looks like Bluebell and Fuchsia," she said. "Oh, they must think you're a girl, but you do look like one. I'll just go and tell them." Edward was beginning to feel awkward again, when he happened to see two small objects speaking with Charlotte. Were those the fairies? If so, he could see them, but that would make both Charlotte and Sophie wrong. But that aside, he was glad they were wrong, for he wanted to see them. "Sophie, I believe I can see the fairies," he said. "What?" asked Sophie. "But seriously, you shouldn't be able to." "I think I can see them, and I'm going to say hello to them." He got up and went over to where Charlotte was speaking to them. "Hello, Bluebell, hello, Fuchsia," said Charlotte. "I guess you've seen my new friend." "Well, I have something important to tell you. She's actually a boy." "A boy?" asked Fuchsia. "Seriously? With pretty long hair, and wearing a dress?" "She looks all girl to me," said Bluebell. "But she is a boy," sighed Charlotte. "Wow, they really do look pretty," came Edward's voice. "Are you really sure, Charlotte, for she can certainly see us," said Bluebell. "And she is coming over." Charlotte turned to see Edward approaching, and after hearing what he had said, was lost for words. "I get to see fairies," he said. "They look really pretty." "You got it wrong, Charlotte. I can see them." "But you're a girl, so you can see and hear us," said Fuchsia. "But Charlotte has told us that you're a boy." "But I am," said Edward. "Yes, I'm dressed as a girl, but there is a reason for that." "You can't be a boy, for boys cannot see us," said Bluebell. "So, if you can see us, you must be a girl." "But I am a boy," said Edward. "I have boy bits." Fuchsia was the one who dared to get the proof, and flew under the skirt of his dress. "Fuchsia," exclaimed Bluebell. "What are you doing?" Even Edward was surprised, and when Fuchsia re-emerged to give her account, she was blushing so hard, her face nearly matched her magenta hair. "He's right," she said in a rather embarrassed voice. Bluebell looked at Edward with a shocked look. "No, this cannot be. The rule has been in place for centuries," she said. "Something is definitely wrong. We need to tell Her Majesty." "We'll be back," said Fuchsia. "I'm sorry about that. But I couldn't think of another way to get the proof." The two fairies left them and headed off to the pool, which they called home. "So, it's true? I'm not supposed to see them?" he asked. "Yes, but yet, you can," said Charlotte. "I'm glad in a way, because they are wonderful friends." "So, I gather the one with pink hair is Fuchsia?" he asked. "Yes, and the one with violet hair is Bluebell," said Charlotte. "They are named after the flower which shares their hair color." It is difficult to tell Daffodil and Buttercup apart at times though. For now, they went over to where Sophie was sat. She was puzzled too, and was glad to get the full story. "Your Majesty, we have a major problem," said Fuchsia, as she and Bluebell arrived at their hidden palace. "A problem?" asked Queen Peony. "Are we in danger?" "Not exactly, Your Majesty," said Bluebell. "Charlotte has a new friend, and he can see us." Queen Peony took a moment to fully apprehend what Bluebell had said. "Did you say he?" "Yes, Your Majesty," replied Bluebell. "It's a boy, and he's living as a girl, though we have no idea what for." "This is unusual," said the Queen. "A boy who can see us." "Does this mean our magic is waning?" asked Fuchsia. "No, there must be another reason. To know for certain, I must see this boy, for the answer may be with him." "Bring him here, please." "As you wish, Your Majesty," said Bluebell and Fuchsia. They flew out, and were soon speaking with the children. "Her Majesty, Queen Peony wishes to see you," said Bluebell to Edward. "There may be something about you that could answer our puzzle." "I'll go with you," said Charlotte. "Let me guess, you're going to the pond?" asked Sophie. "Yes," said Charlotte. "Okay, I'll come too." "I'm supposed to be watching over you." The three of them headed to the pond, and it gave Edward his first look at the many flowers on display. Soon, they were at the pond, and Queen Peony was summoned. Edward's curtsy skills were needed again, as both Charlotte and Sophie did so. Even though Sophie could no longer see the fairies, she was taking cues from Charlotte and Edward. Soon, Queen Peony hovered before them, and they noticed that many more fairies were close by. Queen Peony looked more graceful and more mature than the others, but then, she was the eldest and wisest of them. "Welcome, children," said Queen Peony. "So, we have a question to answer, a boy who can see us." "What is your name, child?" "Edward, Your Majesty," said Edward, deciding it best to use his actual name. "Your appearance is certainly that of a girl, but I doubt that that is the answer." I sense much hurt. You have suffered most of your life, and are now on the run, and hiding from your enemies." Edward felt awkward, as she read his thoughts. "Yet, I feel that your troubles are not yet over," she continued. "I don't want to go back, I don't want to go back," he said, fear in his voice. "You will not go back, for you have suffered more than you should have," said Queen Peony. "But you dress as a girl?" "Obviously, as a way of hiding from your enemies." "I didn't ask to be, but it was the only way possible." "But I'm enjoying it," he replied. "I have friends here, and I want to stay here." I see. "The answer is within you," she said at last. "Your heart speaks clearly, with the voice of a girl." "What?" asked Edward. "While your body is indeed that of a human male, you have the soul of a girl," said Queen Peony. "Does that mean I am a girl?" asked Edward. On the inside, she smiled. "That is why you can see and hear us." "Can I be a girl on the outside too?" he asked. "Please?" "You want to be a girl?" asked Charlotte. "I like the way I look now, though I would like longer hair," he said. "I don't care if he calls me a girl now, because I am a girl." "We can arrange for you to become a girl in body," said Queen Peony. "But it will require the help of a full moon. The magic required is beyond what we possess, so we need a full moon to increase our powers." "How long before the next full moon?" asked Charlotte. 8 days, said Queen Peony. You must meet us here when it is both in the pond and in the sky." "Okay, we'll try to get here then," said Charlotte. "But we'll need help." "I can arrange that," said Queen Peony. "I wish you all the best, Edward. Happiness can be yours if you look in the right place." "Call me Ella," he replied. "Your Majesty." "Ella, it is," she smiled. Part 2. The children headed back to the lawn area of the garden, but took a longer route, since Edward wanted a better look at the various flowers on show. Bluebell and Fuchsia went with them. "What did Queen Peony mean by the moon being in both the pond and the sky?" asked Edward. "It means the moon will be reflected in the pond," said Bluebell. "You have mirrors, don't you?" "Oh, I see," said Edward. "And a full moon is when you see all of it?" "That is right," said Fuchsia. "So, explain a bit more about the people you're hiding from?" "I don't want to say much," he replied. "He's evil." "Does that mean he's an evil wizard or the like?" asked Bluebell. "He doesn't do magic. He just beats people up," said Edward. "And it seems he's looking for me." "Well, he won't find you while you look like that, especially with the long hair," said Fuchsia. "He knows I have long hair," sighed Edward. "He made me grow it, because he thinks I'm a girl." "Does he know how right he is?" said Bluebell with a chuckle. "He uses it as an insult," said Charlotte. "But we know better now. Ella really is a girl." Edward smiled. He really liked Charlotte and wanted to remain her friend. The search party was still out looking for Edward, and the heavy rain had slowed them down a lot. Any tracks left by Edward during the early stages of his flight had been washed away, and the need to find witnesses had increased. "This is taking too long," hissed Mr. Stone. "If the little brat is about, he's likely miles ahead of us." "If he's still alive," said one of the policemen. "If the search goes on for much longer, we may have to consider that as an option." "Well, you haven't got to worry about losing your job," said Mr. Stone. "How far could he possibly get in all this time?" "I can't say," said the policeman. "But circumstances are clearly in his favor. But he'll have to slow down eventually." "Of course," said Mr. Stone, then in a barely audible voice. "And when I find him, I'll beat him to a pulp." Back at the house, Edward was clearly enjoying life a lot more, and more so due to the promise of becoming an actual girl. He never would have guessed that his life would take this turn, but he wanted it now. The next day saw them go outside again, and this time with further company. Roger was the gardener, and worked with his son John. Like all staff, they were restricted to the staff quarters unless they had to meet with Sir Richard or Lady Margaret. Roger was told about Edward, though John was not. This was seen as another means of keeping Edward safe, for word had reached the house that there was indeed a search party out looking for him. The news had come from the postman, who delivered the post to the servants' quarters personally. "Been happening for around 4 days now," he told Mary, who was the one to answer the door. "They must be desperate to find this child, though if any of my children were out lost, I'd be searching near and far till I found them." "Well, if we do spot him, we'll be sure to let them know," said Mary. "Goodbye then." She spread the news to the other staff, and all were now gearing up for a visit. Anyway, Edward, Charlotte and Sophie were out in the garden with Roger and John. Visiting the garden was a favorite pastime for Charlotte, since it meant meeting some of the fairies. It also meant learning about the various plants and flowers from 2 different sources. Roger was certainly well learned in botany, but while he knew much, he found his knowledge challenged by the fairies, whose own knowledge was also extensive. However, he and his son were oblivious to the fact that there were others tending to the flowers too. While the children were busy learning about the garden, Lady Margaret sat at a garden table and watched them from afar. She was still oblivious to the truth about Edward, but with his love for the feminine growing, it was hard to see him as anything but a girl. With her close by, it was to be impossible for the children to head back inside without acknowledging her. The main concern was preventing Edward's scars from showing, but so far, hiding them had proven successful. Of Charlotte's parents, she was the one who spent the most time with her, since Sir Richard's life was dominated by his work. When the chance of guests was minimal, Lady Margaret liked to spend time with her daughter. Her only child. She had wanted more children, but complications surrounding Charlotte's birth had scuppered that hope. It was partly why she had been the one to have Sophie be Charlotte's nanny, for she could be the sister that Charlotte couldn't have. Now seeing Charlotte with Ella gave her further reason to be happy. "Well, Charlotte and Ella have become the best of friends," she told Mary, who was waiting on her, along with Albert. "Yes indeed, my lady," replied Mary. "You would think they were sisters." "Almost time for lunch." "I imagine the girls are getting hungry," said Lady Margaret. "I'll get the food," said Albert. "Thank you, Albert," said Lady Margaret. "Girls! It's time for lunch." For Sophie, having a meal with Lady Margaret was not new. It was simply because of her role as nanny to Charlotte. If Sir Richard was about, it wouldn't be the case, and Sophie would have to eat in the servants' quarters and go back to collect Charlotte later, when called. "Your mother is calling," said Roger. "Yes, and time for sandwiches." "Come on, Ella," said Charlotte. They headed back to the lawn, with Sophie. They also had no less than 3 fairies with them. There was Rose, Lavender, and Snowdrop. They decided to follow, and hang around, though speaking was done in a specific way. Obviously, when it came to talking to the children, when there were unknowing adults about, the children knew better than to respond. It could be considered rude, but the adults would be puzzled as to who they were talking to. Soon, they were sat on the lawn and eating a light lunch. The 3 fairies sat not too far away, but said little. Even so, Charlotte and Edward acknowledged them when they could. "You really are enjoying your stay here, Ella?" asked Lady Margaret. "I imagine you'll be sad to leave when your mother is well again?" "I am enjoying it." "Charlotte is a really good friend," said Edward. "But I do miss my mummy." "I must see if I can arrange for your mother to let you visit here then," said Lady Margaret. Mary and Albert were wondering how that could be arranged. The fact that Edward was getting into character also posed a question: how could he continue to play a girl, without being found out eventually? Of course, they didn't know about the fairies, and what they had planned for Edward. But for now, another expected problem was just around the corner. When Edward returned to the servants' quarters for the night, there was no doubt that he was embracing girlhood, for he was certainly taking a liking for having his hair brushed. He had mentioned wanting his hair longer, because longer hair was pretty. Mary and Doris were often tempted to remind him that he was really a boy, but were distracted by the fact that he was happy, most likely, for the first time in his life. "Okay, so Forsyth House is over there." "Home of Sir Richard Hughes," said one policeman. "I wonder if he would be willing to let us search his house." "You never know, the boy may have sneaked across his land for all we care." "Or could still be there," said Mr. Stone. "Sure, let's pay him a visit. Doesn't hurt to have a little extra influence on your side." They traveled up to the front door in their hansom and knocked. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" asked Albert. "I don't know if you've heard, but there is a search going on in the area. We're looking for a boy, aged 8, who has gone missing from St. Cuthbert's workhouse," said the first of 3 policemen. "We were wondering if you may know anything?" "I can't recall ever seeing a stray boy around these parts," said Albert, doing his utmost to keep a stoic face. "Well, you may not have, but we would like to search the place, on the off chance that the boy has been around here," said a second policeman. "Is his lordship at home?" Albert looked at the group, and more so at the only non-police officer. Mr. Stone was not one for looking trustworthy, and he was pretty much like that now. "His lordship is at his workplace, but his wife is here," replied Albert. "Well, can we talk with her then, please?" asked the first policeman. "Wait here one moment," said the butler. He was lucky to see Mary first. "Be on your guard. There are 3 policemen and a gentleman at the door, searching for a boy." "Oh, okay," she replied. "The girls are in the garden again." With that, they headed off on their current errands. Albert was soon standing before Lady Margaret. "What is it, Albert?" she asked. "There are a group of men at the door, including 3 policemen. They wish to see you." "Policemen, here?" she asked. "What is going on?" "There is a search ongoing for a missing boy." "Oh well, I suppose I'd better let them in." Soon, the small group were stood before her. "Sorry for the intrusion, ma'am, but we are searching for a missing boy," said the head policeman. "We believe he has been seen in the surrounding area, and that he may be hiding within the grounds of your house." "That is absurd." "I imagine my grounds staff would have seen him if he had," said Lady Margaret. "Well, as good as they may be, it is still possible that he could have slipped by," said the head policeman. "Look, we just want to search around, and if you are proven correct, and that he isn't anywhere here, then we will take our leave, and let you be, ma'am." "Oh, very well then," said Lady Margaret. "Albert, round up the servants, and have them help. They're going to need help finding their way around." "As you wish, your ladyship," replied the butler. "This way, sirs." Mary had already been back to the kitchen, to tell Doris and Susan of the situation. "Okay, so where is Ella?" asked Doris. "She's in the garden, with Roger. You know they love learning about flowers," said Mary. "Here they are," said Susan. Mary turned to find Albert with the search party. "Mary, these gentlemen need help searching the premises. Can you lend whatever hands are available?" "No can do," said Doris. "I've got a roast in the oven, and I can't leave it to burn." "Okay, so it's Susan and myself then," said Mary. "Come on." "Could we check the house too?" asked one of the policemen. "Are you suggesting the boy could have somehow broken in?" asked Mary. "It's possible," said Mr. Stone, breaking his silence. "Look, I know this search is important, but if anything, the grounds are the best bet," replied Mary. "We just want to make sure," said the head policeman. "This search has already been ongoing for almost a week, and we really want to reach a conclusion." "Okay, if only to please you," said Mary. "But I feel certain you're wasting your time." So, with Susan and Albert joining her, the group of 7 went searching the house. "That other guy, the one who isn't a Bobby, he looks shifty," said Mary to Albert when she had a chance to talk privately. "I agree," said Albert. "Wouldn't put it past him, if he isn't the one who." Do you have children living here? Asked Mr. Stone, interrupting them. 2 girls, said Mary. One being the Hughes' daughter, and the other being a school friend who is spending the summer here. Good cover story, thought Albert, who didn't want it known that Ella had been at the house for just under the week that Edward had been missing. Okay, so where are they? Asked Mr. Stone. For all you know, they could be helping a boy. You are not a family person, mister, asked Mary. Stone, finished Mr. Stone. I take it, you are? Well, I deal with children who are far from trusting. Children are troublemakers. Well, on this occasion, you are very wrong, and her ladyship will have stern words for you, if you talk about her daughter in that fashion, said Mary. The search of the house proved fruitless, as predicted, forcing the party to search outside. Once again, Edward and Charlotte were with Roger in the garden, as he allowed them to watch him work. I swear I put this plant over there yesterday, he said, pointing to some primroses. You did, but they look better there, said Buttercup. The fairy was with her twin, Daffodil. They were both blonde, and once again were offering their superior knowledge to Edward and Charlotte, who were the only ones aware of their presence. Okay, I've put it back, said Roger. Spoil sport, muttered Buttercup. Charlotte and Edward just smiled, as they enjoyed the secret war between fairies and Gardner. But as those 2 fairies were keeping the children company, the other fairies were not idle. They were the busier gardeners, and were always ensuring the plants and flowers flourished. Most of their work went unnoticed, with Roger and John always getting the credit. That may have upset the fairies, but they didn't want to be discovered. Even if adults couldn't see them, their influences could be seen or felt. Aside from gardening, the fairies provided the house with security. They were always keeping an eye out for anything unusual. We have visitors, said Lavender. For men, 3 in black clothes and tall hats, and 1 who looks really bad. I wonder if these are the ones that Queen Peony predicted, asked Marigold. Because if so, we need to protect Ella. The twins are with them. I'll go over and warn them, said Lavender. She flew over to where the children and Roger were, and immediately went over to the twin fairies. What is it, Lavender? Asked Daffodil. You looked troubled. There are men in the garden, and they may be looking for Ella, replied Lavender. Edward and Charlotte overheard, and looked around. They noticed the policeman, but not Mr. Stone. They won't recognize me, will they? Asked Edward. Who won't recognize you? Asked Roger. Oh, I see. Just keep calm, and act naturally. Luck would have it that 2 of the policemen came over, and not the tyrant that haunted Edward's nightmares. Even so, Edward still felt nervous. Did they know he had long hair? Good day to you, sir, and young missus, said the one policeman. Sorry to bother you, but we are in the midst of a search for a young boy. You haven't seen him by any chance? Not at all, Constable, said Roger. I'm often somewhere in the grounds, with my son, and if anyone were to come onto the grounds, we'd be bound to see them. Where is your son, perchance? Asked the other policeman. He's working on the roses, over by the pond. But I assure you, he isn't the boy you're looking for. That be it may, but we'll still have a word with him, said the first policeman. As for you, young missus, I gather that one of you is Charlotte? Yes, sir, said Charlotte. And this is my friend Ella. Even as she said this, she noticed Buttercup and Daffodil hover over the policeman's shoulders. The fairies put their fingers to their lips, as a gesture to keep silent. But the policemen were now speaking to Edward. Yes, we were told that you are school friends, and that you're here for the summer, said the second policeman. Yes, that's right. We're really good friends, like sisters, said Edward. He was hoping beyond hope that the policeman didn't recognize him, but he noticed that the fairies were doing something. Having a lesson on gardening, I see, asked the second policeman, in a kind voice. Yes, we like learning about flowers, and seeing how pretty they are, said Charlotte. Well, I think we'll leave you two to your lesson, said the first policeman. Good day to you all. As they watched the two policemen leave, they breathed a sigh of relief. Blooming heck, your disguise is better than I thought, said Roger. Yes, it is, smiled Edward, as he smiled in the direction of the fairies. We can influence people, to a degree, said Daffodil. But you do look like a girl. As they watched the policemen head elsewhere, they saw Sophie approaching. She had to go back inside, to go to the toilet, and had missed the action. Have I missed anything? She asked. Just 2 coppers, said Roger. The search party is here. He pointed to where the policemen were headed, and Sophie saw the group of 4. Not him. Oh, no, not him, panicked Edward. Edward had glanced over, and seen the evil that was Mr. Stone. He quickly turned away, as the bane of his life appeared to look over. No, the girls know nothing, as does the gardener, said the first policeman, still partly under the fairy's influence. How about the girls themselves? Asked Mr. Stone. They look young enough. I see where you're going, said the second policeman. But they're both clearly girls. I should know, for I have 2 daughters, of me own. Mr. Stone did glance over again, but he could only see Edward's back now. The policemen were convinced, and he had to take their word for it. A short while later, they were headed back into the house, and for Edward, the coast was clear. They're gone, said Lavender, who had been following them. Are you okay? Edward was still recovering from seeing Mr. Stone. He looked at me. I hope he never recognized me, he said, his voice trembling. He's the one who hurt you, isn't he? Asked Sophie. Edward nodded. Well, he didn't come over, so he couldn't have recognized you, said Roger. Only proves that your disguise is good. I suppose those coppers don't know your face, but if someone who does couldn't recognize you, you're safe. I knew he was bad, said Lavender. I could really sense it. Later in the day, when Roger was no longer with them, Edward and Charlotte thanked the fairies properly for the help. Meanwhile, Sophie did pass on the information to her mom concerning Mr. Stone. So, that's the beast who caned Edward? I'm not surprised, for the way he talked about the girls, said Mary. At least Ella is safe for now. Do you think they'll come back? Asked Susan. I doubt it, said Albert. The policemen are convinced that the place is clear. They'll need some hard evidence to search again. It was true that the policemen had finished searching the place, and that would be a problem for Mr. Stone. He had got the slightest glance at Edward, and from a distance. He pondered whether it was possible that the brunette girl was the missing boy. He couldn't be sure until he had seen her close up. One of the further reasons why Edward had remained safe was that his workhouse clothes had been destroyed. Roger had placed them on a bonfire that he had built to dispose of some garden rubbish. After the fire had gone out, any charred remains had been placed in the compost heap. Anyway, there were 6 days left to the full moon, and it all seemed as though nothing was going to get in the way of Edward's road to complete freedom and to girlhood. I wish you were my sister, said Charlotte the following day, as they played together in the nursery. I've always wanted a brother or sister, but Mummy says she can't give me one. Why not? Asked Edward. I don't know why, but she can't, replied Charlotte. Her ladyship has always wanted more children, but after having Charlotte, was told she couldn't, said Sophie. I only heard this from my mum, so I can't say why either. The friendship between Edward and Charlotte had certainly gotten noticed, and for the servants, it did give them reason to feel awkward. Edward was a boy, and would grow into a man. He couldn't pretend to be a girl all his life. With the threat of the search now over, they now could discuss when to move Edward to another home. The main possibility was to have him move in with Mary. But the threat was not yet over, for Mr. Stone had not gotten Ella out of his mind. He wanted to make sure what gender this girl was, as he tried to visualize Edward in a dress. But with the search party in two minds as what to do next, with some ready to continue, and some ready to call it quits, he was faced with having to satisfy his suspicions alone. He decided to do it on the sly, trespassing to be precise. The search party was by now contemplating the odds of finding Edward dead, and had slowly ventured further on from the house. They were now checking areas where Edward hadn't even been. Mr. Stone's first illegal venture into the house grounds came 2 days after his official visit. In doing so, he thought of what the servants had said, and that it would have been impossible to enter the grounds without being seen. Using any trees close by as cover, he found a place close to the lawn, which also offered him a hiding place, or so he thought. The fairies were always vigilant, and more effective than the humans who lived there, simply because most couldn't see or hear them. They were prepared to help guard the premises from intruders, in their own unique way. Well, it looks like the girls are out to enjoy the fine weather again, Daisy, said Marigold. Ella is truly embracing her inner girl now. Look how she skips about. So true, and I'm happy for her. Anyway, we've got to collect some red currants. There's some on the outskirts of the garden, replied Daisy. I know where they are, said Marigold. Wait, what's that? Asked Daisy. It's a pair of shoes. There's a trespasser here. Hiding between hedges, Mr. Stone was watching the children at play, and hoping that the brown-haired girl turned around so as to give him a look at her face. His luck wasn't in, for she had sat down with her back turned. It wasn't going to improve either. It's him. It's that creep from the search party, said Marigold. He's looking at the girls. Right, he is certainly not staying, said Daisy. Let's see how he likes this. She caused a plant to just appear and grow, right where Mr. Stone was kneeling. It was a bramble, and it was growing in the direction of his rear. He jumped with a start, as the thorny shrub brushed against his rear. He got up, and turned to see what had stung him, only to find that Daisy had made the bramble disappear just as quickly. But in getting up, his cover had been blown, and when he turned back towards the garden, the children were heading back inside. Darn it, he hissed. He had no choice but to make a run for it, as it was likely the children might raise the alarm. While Daisy was dealing with him, Marigold had gone back to the pond. Queen Peony needed to be told. Do you think he knows that Ella is Edward? Asked Marigold. If he was only watching, then it may be that he doesn't, but suspects she is, said Queen Peony. The children need to be watched. I've managed to get rid of him, Your Majesty, said Daisy, now arriving. I don't think he'll be back. He may be, though, replied Queen Peony. Let's see where he is headed. They went to the pond itself, and Queen Peony watched within the water, Mr. Stone running away from the house. Much rides on the success of his mission, she said. But it will fail. Back at the house, the children had indeed reported the intruder. The servants were the first, followed by Charlotte's parents. No one was aware of who it was, not until later. Daisy appeared at the nursery window, and Charlotte let her in. "The intruder was the man from the search party," she said. "I managed to scare him off, but we don't know whether he will be back." "Oh no," groaned Edward. "He must have recognized me the other day." "Her Majesty doesn't think he knows who you are." "He must suspect though, and is looking to get a better look," said Daisy. "Oh, I wish that full moon would hurry up, and I'll be a real girl then, and I'll be safe from him," sighed Edward. "Don't worry, Ella," said Charlotte. "Not long now." "4 days to be precise," said Daisy. "That's still too long," said Edward. "Have patience, child. All will be well, and that evil man will not succeed," said Daisy. "Anyway, I must be off. Don't be afraid of coming back outside, for we will be there to protect you." The news of the intruder had certainly given Sir Richard food for thought. The fact that Mr. Stone had managed to avoid being caught only made things worse. Only the children knew who he was, but weren't able to say, because they had already explained that they didn't get a clear look at him at the time. Sophie had already mentioned to Edward that talk of the fairies had to be kept quiet, since her mother Mary didn't like the subject due to her own skepticism. The next day, the children stayed indoors, for the weather took an ill turn and rained. This did affect the search too, and the mood amongst the searchers was one of defeat. Only Mr. Stone, whose job rested on the search being fruitful, wanted to continue. Indeed, the news of the search had filtered back to the workhouse, and Mr. Styles was not happy in the slightest. Mr. Stone didn't know what to do, save for continuing to think about the brunette girl at Forsyth House. He hadn't gotten a better look at her in the short time he had spied on her, and how his cover had been blown was beyond him. He needed to try again, but with the household now on alert, was it really worth it? Edward had been living as Ella for almost a week, and with the search for him waning, the plans for his future were being discussed further. But the intruder incident hadn't been overlooked. "Do you think the intruder was one of the search party?" asked Doris. "I have no idea," said Albert. "But they were completely fooled by his disguise." "The coppers were," said Mary. "That Mr. Stone merely went along with them. Plus, he's the one who gave him those scars. He clearly knows what Edward looks like." "Are you suggesting he was the intruder?" asked Doris. "Who else? He's got no good written all over him," said Mary. "It's a pity we never caught sight of him." "Well, if they try again, whoever it is, we'll be ready," said Susan. "And perhaps that young lad will finally be free from that workhouse," added Doris. Part 3. Edward was marking a full week as Ella, and was certainly feeling comfortable as a girl. The promise of being changed into an actual girl was drawing nearer, just another 2 days. Only Charlotte and Sophie were aware of this, and the servants, including Mary, were preparing to reintroduce Edward to living as a boy, including giving him a haircut. But they were prepared to wait, since concluding that an intruder who had somehow sneaked in was the workhouse supervisor, Mr. Stone. If it was, then Ella was staying put until he gave up. After staying indoors due to rain, the children ventured out again the next day, and were joined by 2 fairies, Rose and Snowdrop. Other fairies were scattered about the garden, watching for signs of Mr. Stone. The chances of him trying again seemed good, if Queen Peony's thoughts were right, and she was very rarely wrong. Alas, she wasn't to be wrong, as Mr. Stone had the audacity to try again. This time, he was equipped with binoculars, and hoped to find a more remote place to hide. He had gone as far as approaching from the other side, so that he was now looking towards his previous hiding place. To further his chances, he had decided to hide in the branches of a tree. Right, this is so much better, he grinned as he peered through his binoculars. This bough should hold out too. The children were happily playing on the lawn, unaware that they were again being watched. Mr. Stone was unaware that he too was about to be spotted, but from afar. "He's here," said Queen Peony. "I can feel it." "There's been no sign of him from our scouts," said Bluebell. "He's not that close," replied the Queen. "Let's see where." She hovered above the pond and waved her hand over the surface. "He's in a tree, over the east side, some 200 yards from the boundary," she said. "It's too late. It's him. It has to be him." "The little sissy is living up to his freakish name," said Mr. Stone with glee. "Oh, you'll be so sorry for this. You're not getting away with this." He began to climb down from his tree, and upon reaching the ground, he headed off. As much as he wanted to invade the garden and grab Edward, he opted against it. He wanted to do the next bit by the book, and bring the police in. The servants would pay for hiding him, and Sir Richard would be hit with a scandal, and he would punish Edward severely. He didn't see the fairies approaching, and while they were unable to stop him, they would achieve something. Daisy was among them, and she caused a bramble to appear in his path. He was too eager to get away, and didn't see it. However, while he didn't trip on it as she hoped, he did catch his one trouser leg on it, and it tore a piece from it. "Ouch! Blasted bramble," he said with gritted teeth. He took a quick glance down at his leg before continuing. He got away," sighed Daffodil. "He must have seen her." "If so, why didn't he just come and snatch her?" asked Daisy. "I don't know." "We've got to tell Queen Peony," said Daffodil. Queen Peony was watching events unfold, and after seeing the failed attempt to trip him up, pondered what to do next. "Why is he running, Your Majesty?" "If he knows who Ella is, why didn't he just come for her?" asked Bluebell. "If he tried to snatch her, it would only work against him," said Queen Peony. "He will make an official visit to out her." "So, he's going to tell the others first?" "Yes, and without mentioning his trespassing," replied Queen Peony. "He'll create a story that will suggest he learned the information in a legal way." "So, he'll win," sighed Bluebell. "No, he won't," smiled Queen Peony. "Tell the girls about him and where he was." Daisy hasn't failed at all. Bluebell went to see the girls, and told them about what had transpired. Edward was truly distraught, but Bluebell assured him that all was not yet lost. Anyway, Sophie got the message, and went to find someone quickly. Mom, the intruder has been back," she said, heading into the house. Mary happened to be in the servants' quarters at the time, enjoying a tea break, when she got the news. "Where?" she asked. "Albert, tell her ladyship." "Call the police." Albert was soon on to it, while Sophie led her mother outside and pointed out where the intruder had been seen. "I think he got away though," she added. "Drat," said Mary. "We've got to catch him. We think it might be that workhouse creep." "The one who came here with the coppers?" asked Sophie, pretending she didn't know. "That's him. We think he might suspect Ella's true identity." "Then I hope he didn't see her." "He was up in a tree," said Sophie. "Anyway, we've called the cops. Not much use if he's gotten away again." All this didn't offer much to comfort Edward, who had pinned his promised sex change on being his true ticket to freedom from the workhouse. However, he was to receive a visit from Queen Peony, as he and Charlotte played in the nursery later that day. Both curtsied, as the Fairy Queen was given access through the window. "Do not fear, Ella, for what has happened will not hinder your future," she said. "It is true that he did see you, but he must now convince the police of his claim, and that won't be easy. However, he will have a harder time proving that he didn't trespass on the grounds of this house." She not only said it, but caused the words to appear on a small piece of paper, just so Sophie could know what she said. "You mean there is proof that he trespassed?" asked Sophie. "Yes, there is," replied Queen Peony, again writing it down for Sophie. "But I've left it there for your policeman to find." "But if he is able to prove that Ella is Edward, then that won't be much use," asked Sophie. "The full moon is in 2 nights. He will be delayed, for as I've said, he needs to convince the police." "As for the full moon, Your Majesty," said Charlotte, "we will need help leaving the house at night. Do not fear, for I intend to send help to you. Just make sure this window is open." Lady Margaret was clearly fuming when she was told that the intruder had struck again, and had managed to escape again. Still, she was all for the calling of the police. Sir Richard was equally annoyed, and made it known, when the police did show up. The servants made certain not to mention their suspicions about the intruder being Mr. Stone, in case it led to them questioning the identity of Ella. All that needed to be known was that the intruder was interested in the children, for reasons they imagined unsavory. "You don't have any enemies, who may wish to hurt you in any way?" asked the sergeant who had arrived. "No, not that I know of," replied Sir Richard. "What would they want with my daughter?" "Kidnapping is one thing," replied the sergeant. "Anyway, where was this person seen?" "Albert, take them to the spot," said Sir Richard. Albert was by now aware of the place, but hadn't been there. In fact, none of the servants had, so when they arrived, they found only one set of footprints. "Someone has been here for certain, Sarge," said another policeman. "Look, your intruder didn't get away too cleanly," said the other. "He caught his trousers on this bramble." "Well, that's something," said the sergeant. "We'll get some casts of those footprints too. Hopefully, we'll find this intruder, and have him locked up." "Well, we hope you find him," said Mary. "Looking at that bramble, I imagine he might have suffered a scratch to his leg too." Mr. Stone had got the information he had sought. He knew now that the brown-haired girl was Edward in disguise, and he now sought the backing of the police, to go back to the house and have Edward taken from them. He was also smarting from the bramble that he had almost tripped on when getting away. Aside from a torn trouser leg, he now had a deep scratch on his leg. He had ripped a piece of his shirt off and wrapped it around the cut. He had another pair of trousers at home, and he could always say he had scratched his leg elsewhere. But as Queen Peony had mentioned, his claims were not being bought easily. The police who were still on the search, which was now being wound down, wanted to know where he was getting his evidence from. He was clearly trying to think of ways in which he could have seen Edward without the whole trespassing on private property lark, but found it difficult. The first policemen he met were the ones he had been with when searching the house, and they were very much sticking with their verdict, Ella is all girl. By the time he would get anyone to listen to him, those policemen would be absolutely right. "I'll see you later, Ella," said Charlotte, as Ella left the nursery with Sophie. "Bye," said Edward, with a smile. There had been no news on the intruder, but it seemed that he had given up. The day that Edward had been looking forward to had arrived, and he just couldn't wait for the evening and a short walk to the pond. He was wondering how the fairies were going to help him get outside, since he slept in the same room as Doris and Susan. But the fairies had a way, and he would find out. Even so, he was unable to sleep, as the excitement prevented him. As for Charlotte, her worries were not so bad. Sophie had left the one window ajar, just to allow the fairies to enter. Rose and Snowdrop had been sent to help, and Charlotte was awoken by them. "My door is locked," said Charlotte. "No worries," said Snowdrop. "Nothing we can't do." She waved her arms, and the door lock clicked. Charlotte, now wearing slippers, opened the door and together they headed downstairs. The next stop was the servants' quarters, and this was to be the main test, for there were adults close by. For the purposes of remaining quiet, Snowdrop called out for Edward, since he and Charlotte were the only ones who could hear her. Soon, they located the room, thanks to Edward replying, albeit in as quiet a voice that could still be heard. Rose opened the door this time, and they found Edward ready to leave. He was partly looking at Doris in the neighboring bed, who was snoring. Just to make him feel better, Snowdrop watched the cook, just to ensure she didn't stir. The door was then closed softly. "I'll lock it, just to be safe," said Snowdrop, who was last out. "We'll head out through the servants' entrance. The garden is still accessible from there," said Rose. The children sneaked towards the door and let the fairies open it. Now, they were free to make the walk to the pond at the back, where Edward would have his wish granted. The place was in darkness, and for the children, they couldn't see anything but the fairies, who had the ability to glow. Thanks to them, and whatever light the full moon gave, they were able to reach the pond. The sight was amazing, as numerous fairies were gathered, all aglow, and in the pond, the moon's reflection shone brightly. "Welcome, children," said Queen Peony. "I'm glad you have reached here safely." Both Edward and Charlotte curtsied before her. Queen Peony then turned to Edward. "Ella, you have the spirit of a girl, yet the body of a boy. Do you wish for your body to match your spirit?" "I would like to become a girl, if that is what you mean, Your Majesty," replied Edward. "Yes, child. Now, step into the pond and stand within the moon's reflection." Edward took off his own slippers and stepped into the pond. He was hoping it wasn't too deep, as he couldn't swim. But it was knee-deep, and he reached the required spot safely. "We have felt your pains, your sorrows, and now the happiness that has come to you. Now, you shall be reborn," said Queen Peony. Several fairies flew around him, leaving trails of light in their wake. The moon's reflection began to shine brighter as Queen Peony drew closer and completed the ritual. "Lady Lunar, grant us your power to bestow upon this child her rightful form, that she may spend the rest of her life in happiness." The light from the reflection surrounded Edward in a column, and he could now feel tingling throughout his body. He was becoming daintier, his hair growing longer. Charlotte watched from the edge of the pond in awe, as Edward underwent his transformation. "Daughter, sister, maiden, your request has been answered, your heart's desire granted," said Queen Peony. "Your true form has been bestowed upon you. Arise, Ella Hughes." The column of light withdrew, and from the edge of the pond, Charlotte was now able to see the new girl, albeit from the rear. This did give her a good look at her longer hair, which certainly looked better. However, she was taken aback by Ella's surname, her own. Ella, still up to her knees in water, looked down and saw her reflection, with longer hair, and a face that was certainly more feminine. She was moved to tears. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Thank you all," she said. "I feel so happy." "You are welcome," replied Queen Peony. "Now, I believe your sister would like a better look at you." "My sister? But, you knew?" "Your heart's desire. Charlotte has longed for a sister, and you've wanted to be that sister. Now you are her sister, her twin sister," replied Queen Peony. Ella walked towards Charlotte, and as she left the pond, she was surprised to see that her dress and legs were dry. As soon as she was close to Charlotte, her new sister took her in a hug, which she returned in kind. "I'll just add that you're not identical, since you have different hair colors," said Queen Peony. "But any twins are special," said Bluebell. "Thank you for giving me a sister, Your Majesty," said Charlotte. "You are welcome," replied Queen Peony. "Now, you need to return to bed. As you are now sisters, you'll find things are a little different. Just you two, Sophie, and one other, will remember Edward. Everyone else will remember just Ella." "Who's the other?" asked Charlotte. "Someone who is asking for trouble," smiled Queen Peony. "We'll see you later. Goodbye, and good luck." Rose and Snowdrop once again guided them, this time back to the house, and upon entering, went to the nursery. There, they found 2 beds instead of 1. "I know you're still brimming with happiness, but you need to go to bed," said Rose. Charlotte's bed was where it had always been, leaving the new bed as Ella's. "I think they are going to struggle to sleep," smiled Snowdrop. "You have a big day ahead, so you need the rest." The fairies went and helped the girls fall asleep, and they slept happily, with dreams of a bright future on their minds. Snowdrop wasn't wrong, for the next day would be big. Queen Peony hadn't altered all reality for the new girl, since there was a loose end to tie up. "Good morning, Charlotte," said Sophie, as she entered the nursery. "Good morning, Ella." "Wait, what are you doing here?" "I'm Charlotte's sister now," replied Ella. "My twin sister," added Charlotte. "Wow, so that alters things a bit," replied Sophie. "You are a girl too, and your hair looks much prettier." "You can brush it if you like," smiled Ella. "But I wonder what Doris is going to say when you're not with her." "But then, no one has mentioned you at all this morning," said Sophie. "Have the fairies done something else too?" "Only you, us, and one other can remember me being a boy," replied Ella. "I think I might know who the other is." "So, Edward is gone?" "Not really," said Ella. "But I just want to enjoy today, and every day from now on, because I'm a girl." Okay. "Be quiet," said Sophie. "My job has truly doubled. Let's get both of you dressed and ready for breakfast." It was going to be some morning for Sophie, as Ellen needed to learn a few things on the rules of the house. As she helped them get ready, the twins did give her an account of the ritual at the pond. "Well, this is something," said Sophie, as she helped Ella out of her nightdress. "You haven't any scars on you. They've all gone." "What?" asked Ella. She was shown, by being stood in front of the standing mirror. She was amazed, and delighted at the same time. "Edward is no longer the escaped boy," said Sophie. "I'm really pleased for you." With this wonderful discovery, Ella was soon getting dressed. Charlotte and Ella were soon heading downstairs, to the dining room, where they would have breakfast with their parents. For both of them, they were keen to see how their parents reacted to them having 2 daughters instead of 1. They didn't know that the reality hadn't altered much. Lady Margaret was still incapable of having further children, but had given birth to twin girls rather than a single girl. Neither parent was bemused at the sudden appearance of a second daughter, and so, following breakfast, the twins headed back to the nursery with Sophie. "Things have changed," said Sophie. "It's as though you've always been twins." She was eager to find out how this had affected her mom and the other servants, having not fully understood what had happened when she arrived earlier that morning. Mr. Stone was feeling smug. He had managed to convince the police that the missing boy was passing himself off as a girl at Forsyth House. Part of his success was only now mentioning that the boy had longer than average hair. If only he knew that things were set to go wrong in a big way for him. For a start, he was the only one outside the house who knew that Ella was Edward. Everyone else knew that Ella was one of Sir Richard Hugh's daughters. They thought he was referring to a third girl. But one thing that hadn't changed was that he still bore the cut to the back of his one leg. The search for an intruder was still on. Anyway, he was heading to the house, with a trio of policemen, hoping to finally lay his hands on the boy who had given him so much trouble. Charlotte, Ella, and Sophie were out in the garden again, simply because they wanted to thank the fairies again. A few fairies had come over to see them, simply to accept the thanks, and to see how she was coping. But what was surprising was that Queen Peony herself came over. "Your Majesty, this is an honor," said Charlotte. "Today is going to be busy for you, Ella," she said. "All I ask is for you to be not afraid." "Wait, you mean he is coming?" asked Ella. "He is, but don't be afraid. He still believes that you are Edward, but proving it will be impossible," said Queen Peony. "You have nothing to fear. Your freedom is almost complete." "But Edward no longer exists, Your Majesty," said Charlotte. "How can anyone be still looking for him?" "Good point, but I left that one detail unchanged. Sure, they are looking for a boy that no longer exists, but they are all but ready to call off the search." "Except for him," sighed Ella. "Stay calm, Ella. It's his turn to suffer," replied Queen Peony. Sure enough, Mr. Stone had arrived, along with 3 policemen. The honest truth was that they, the policemen, were not totally convinced. "We would like to speak with the master of the house, please, on an urgent matter," asked the sergeant. "What matter would this be?" asked Albert. "You're hiding a boy in these 4 walls, and dressing him as a girl, no less," interjected Mr. Stone. "You are mistaken, sir," said Albert. "What is it, Albert?" asked Sir Richard, coming to the door. "Ah, we would like to discuss the possibility that you are harboring a missing boy," said the sergeant. "Preposterous," replied Sir Richard. "The only children here are my 2 daughters." "Well, I beg to disagree," said Mr. Stone. "We're really sorry about this," added the sergeant. "But this man is convinced." "Oh, I see, and he won't drop this ridiculous claim until it's been proven wrong?" asked Sir Richard. "Sure, let's see how strong your claim is." The party were allowed in, and taken to the reception room. "Albert, please go and fetch my daughters," said Sir Richard, as they entered the room. "What is going on?" asked Lady Margaret, who was sewing. "This man believes we are hiding a boy, and dressing him as a girl, no less," replied her husband. "Your claims are hollow, sir," said Lady Margaret. "Upon what information do you base these claims?" "A few days ago, you allowed us to search these premises for a boy that is on the run from the workhouse where I work," said Mr. Stone. "We met 2 girls in the garden, of which one struck me as looking familiar." She may have fooled the policeman, but not me. One of them is the missing boy, said Mr. Stone. You are delusional, said Lady Margaret. We shall see, smiled Mr. Stone. When Charlotte and Ella were called into the house, they had been given one extra piece of advice by the fairies. Sophie accompanied them, and soon, the three of them were in the reception room. As the twins went over to their mother, Ella looked upon the vile man who had been her bane for far too long, and her discomfort couldn't be hidden. That's him, shouted Mr. Stone. The one with the brown hair. That is Ella, my one daughter, replied Lady Margaret. You're trying to tell me that my one daughter is a boy? Demanded Sir Richard. She is a boy, protested Mr. Stone. The argument then took a twist, as Charlotte spoke up. That's the man who was in the tree, she said. He was also behind a hedge a few days ago. What? Exclaimed Sir Richard. You are the intruder? No, I am not. I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, replied Mr. Stone. The policemen were aware of this though, as the sergeant had been at the house when the second intrusion had been reported. Well, if you are not the intruder, then you won't have a scratch on your one leg, said the sergeant. Wait, what are you doing? Asked Mr. Stone, as his legs were investigated. Well, that's a scratch, said the one policeman. You're under arrest for trespassing on private property. You don't understand. I was doing this to prove a point, that girl there is a boy. He wrestled free from the clutches of the policeman and lunged for Ella. Ella backed away in fear, only for the fiend to rip her dress off. She has scars on her back. Can you see? Ella was distraught, standing in just her underwear. Mr. Stone was hopeful, but found Sir Richard directing a punch at his face. He was soon on the floor, with blood trickling from his nose. You bastard! How dare you touch my daughter in that manner? Ella was soon being comforted by her mother, who decided to give Mr. Stone one more blow. She lifted up Ella's bodice and showed him her back. Not a scar to be seen. No, it can't be. No, 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 he cried, his claim now in tatters. She has to be a boy, she has to be. Take him away, said Sir Richard. He's delusional. Mr. Stone was back on his feet, thanks to the policeman helping him up. He was soon in handcuffs and being led out of the house. I hope they lock him away, said Lady Margaret. Absolutely mad. Are you okay, my sweetheart? Asked Sir Richard to Ella. Yes, Daddy, she replied. Sophie took them back to the nursery and found a new dress for Ella. Only now, in the privacy of this room, could they openly speak. He's been arrested, said Ella, now with a new dress, and feeling more relaxed. I'm so glad. After all the things he did, I'm glad too, sis, added Charlotte. Seeing Daddy punch him in the face was good too. He was so convinced about you, chuckled Sophie. Seeing how your back is scarless really got him. I never saw them. I only ever felt them, and that was bad, said Ella. But it's over. I'm free. Ella was finally free from the shadow of Mr. Stone, and she now had a family who loved her. She continued to live at the house until the summer was over, when she and Charlotte were being sent to boarding school. They would be back home for Christmas and Easter. But until then, they spent a lot more time in the garden, sharing time with their special and very secret friends. But she wasn't the only one who was freed from Mr. Stone's terror. With his convictions, Mr. Stone was relieved of his job, and so all the other boys at the workhouse were free from him. His continued claims that Ella was a boy only made his situation worse, and he was placed in a mental asylum, where he spent the rest of his days. As for the search for Edward, it was called off just hours after Mr. Stone was arrested. Those who had been leading the search couldn't provide a solid conclusion, with them suggesting that he had met a horrid end or had been taken in by a family. They had no idea that the latter was absolutely true.